David Mays, broker, co-founder of Vivo Realty. We are back. I'm going to be explaining the information about brokerage services. And when I'm explaining these forms, I'm going to do so in the most contrite way that I can and really get through the material as quickly as possible. With these videos, it's great because you can pause, you can go back, and that's what I love about YouTube videos or videos in particular because they're great for learning tools or great learning tools. And I realized that I do not have my caffeine, so I'll have to get that later for the next video. But nonetheless, let's proceed. So, information about brokerage services. Number one, you are going to give this to your prospect with the first substantive discussion of real estate. And what does substantive mean? Substantive means any conversation that has meat and potatoes behind it about real estate. So, for example, if I ask what color a door is, that's not really a real estate question. If I ask what the price per square foot is in a certain neighborhood, that's a real estate question, which would trigger then the use for the information about brokerage services. Now, back in the day, truth be told, I would just put this in front of the consumer and have them review it and sign it. And I would say something like, hey, here, this is required by the state of Texas. This is information about brokerage services. Would you please sign this and give it back to me? Don't do that. You want to come across as an expert and not just come across as an expert. You want to be the expert. So remember to explain these forms, explain what you're putting in front of people. It's very, very important for them to see you as an expert. And so let's go through it really quickly. So first of all, types of real estate license holders, you have a broker and you have a sales agent. So in a situation where many of you are just going to be agents, you're going to be an agent representing them as a buyer's agent or a seller's agent, a landlord agent, a tenant representative, so on and so forth. And so you're just explaining that to them. In this other paragraph, these are the broker's minimum duties required by law. And again, I'm not reading this entire form to people. What I'm doing is just pointing out the bullet points. So I may say something like, okay, this information about brokerage services is required by the state of Texas. We're going to go through it briefly. And I really love this form because it just gives you some insight into some of the terminology and some of the ways in which you can be represented. And so I'll say in this situation, in this scenario, even though I am a broker of record, I'm going to be representing you as a buyer's agent, for example, which means it's going to be my duty to help you find and secure a property for purchase. And of course, helping you through its entirety, which we'll go over all the buyer representation forms here shortly. Also, you need to be aware of intermediary. That would only happen in an in-house transaction, which means you have a buyer client and a seller client within the same brokerage. And so, for example, if I'm showing you a property that is also listed by Vivo Realty and you want to put an offer on that property, well, at that moment in time, we would have an intermediary because Vivo Realty has a seller client and also a buyer client. And so there's different ways in which we can do that. We can do it with appointments or without appointments, which means they can appoint another person to be represented. In the situation that it's a different agent within Vivo, then there would already be that natural appointment there. If it's one of my listings, then we would have to appoint somebody on your behalf. So that way you get representation there. And we'll explain intermediary and the buyer's rep as well. And so I don't try to confuse too much because that can be a little more of a complex topic to discuss with a potential buyer. So don't get yourself into a rabbit hole. Just give them a quick analogy and move forward. Subagency is the paragraph that I love because this is what allows me to get a buyer's representation signed 100% of the time. And the reason being, and again, we're always leading with ethics, right? We're always leading with ethics. We're not trying to twist anybody's arm to get them to do anything. But I love logic and I love how this paragraph really breaks down what subagency is. So, subagency paragraph reads like this. A license holder acts as a subagent when aiding a buyer in a transaction without an agreement to represent the buyer. A subagent can assist the buyer but does not represent the buyer and must place the interests of the owner first. So at that point, I'll look at the buyer prospect and say, you know, that just doesn't sound like a very fair way to be represented because I have to put the owner's interest above your interest. If I represent you, I have to put your interest above my interest, and anything that you tell me is confidential that I don't have to disclose anything to the listing agent. So really, the purpose of our meeting here is to get you into a buyer-client situation where I represent you as notated here, and that way I can represent you fully as opposed to representing you via a sub-agency. So, and then it goes on to disclose how important it is that everything should be in writing. Why would the form say this? Well, we know that anything done on a handshake agreement or anything done verbally, which by the way, verbal agreements are legal in the state of Texas. What it does state, however, is if you're representing a buyer via oral buyer's agency, you do have a client, you do have a buyer client. but you are volunteering your time. Nobody wants to volunteer their time unless it's for charity purposes, right? And that you cannot enforce that agreement against the buyer. They can only enforce it against you. So in reality, it's just not a good way to go about this, whether it's oral buyer's agency, or to not have a buyer client at all and only to work via a sub agency. And you might not get paid on a sub agency either. So you'll have to look at that on the MLS as well. Anyhow, short and sweet and to the point information about brokerage services. The very, very important form. Make sure that you reference this again. Understand this is how it's written in our brokerage. If you're with a different brokerage, it'll be written differently, obviously. Make sure that your forms are up to date and make sure that you have your IABS form on all the appropriate places in your signature and any advertising that you're doing, and obviously making sure that you're getting it in front of the prospect when you do have that first substantive dialogue about a real estate. Hopefully this has been helpful to you guys. Please feel free to reference back to this. There'll also be a PDF example that you can reference as well on all these forms. If you are in another brokerage and you have questions, you can DM, you can comment, and ultimately, if you're having problems where you are, you have a lot of questions where you are, come join Vivo Realty because we do this often. We're big on training and we want to make sure that you are educated. So thanks everybody. On to the next forum.